There was, for a brief time in the 1960s, a car that was as famous and beloved among its owners as it was infamous amongst the uninformed. This car was unique and innovative, and it was a compact entry from Chevrolet, which they called the Corvair. Now, I've already told you the story about Don Yanko's crazy quest to turn the Corvair into an SCCA Class D production racer. But there's more than one way to skin a cat, and definitely more than one way to burn rubber. What I haven't told you yet is the story of how Chevrolet had their own plans to make the Corvair faster, a plan that would incorporate some pretty new tech to squeeze some more power and torque out of that little engine. Today, we're covering the factory turbocharged Chevrolet Corvair, which put forced induction onto a factory rear-mounted flat six, 12 years before Porsche's first 911 Turbo. And as I mentioned, the Corvair Turbo might have been the first ever factory turbocharged car. It was neck and neck upon release with the Oldsmobile F85 Turbo Jetfire, and different sources that I found have claimed that it was the first or was the second. Either way, these cars came out so close to each other in time, only a matter of weeks separated the two first true production turbocharged cars. In fact, when the Turbo Corvair first came out, the word turbocharged still hadn't been standardized. The first offering of the Corvair Turbo was in 1962, and the official documents from the time call it the Supercharged Spider. Nowadays, we all know that turbocharged means the turbine is forced back by the exhaust gases, and a supercharger means that the engine spins the turbine instead of the exhaust gases spinning the turbine. But back in the day, these things weren't written in stone yet, and the Corvair had a funny story to itself. After the failure of the Chevy Cadet in the 1950s, Ed Cole still believed that there was a place for a compact offering from Chevrolet. He commissioned a study in the late 1950s comparing drivetrain configurations, which came to the conclusion that a rear-mounted, rear-drive car might just be the future for compact vehicles. Volkswagen, Renault, Fiat, and Porsche were already using this drivetrain configuration, but it, along with the compact size of Ed Cole's vehicle vision, were so out of step with the other executives at Chevy that he kept the project somewhat a secret, as something to be produced for the Australian market, at least until he could reveal a complete proposal for what would eventually become the Corvair. That way he couldn't get stopped early in his tracks. The first Corvairs, not the turbo ones, were sold in 1960 with a few different trim and engine options. All of them were powered by an air-cooled flat six that was ironically called the Turbo Air 6, even though they were all naturally aspirated at first. To Ed's surprise, the lower-end and cheaper versions sold all right, but there turned out to be a large market for the more souped-up Monza versions of the Corvair. The desire for a fast, compact, mid-engine or rear-engine car would be there for a few years, and people started calling the Corvair the poor man's Porsche, and its price tag was about half of that of a similar offering from Porsche. Then, in 1962, James Bradford, Robert Thorson, and Bob Benzinger got together to attach a turbocharger to that Corvair flat six and make the necessary changes to handle the additional power and torque in the modest chassis. At the time, the best factory naturally aspirated engine in the Corvair was making 102 horsepower at 4,400 RPM and 134 foot-pounds of torque at 2,900 RPM. The supercharged Spider upped that to 150 horsepower at 4,400 RPM and a whopping 210 foot-pounds of torque at 3,300 RPM. To make this happen, they did have to drop the compression ratio on the motor to accommodate the turbo from 9-to-1 down to 8-to-1. The turbo they used for the Corvair was actually very primitive by today's standards. It was made by the same company that would soon become TRW, and it was limited to 10 pounds of boost at the max. It had no wastegate and no intercooler, but it still made good power and torque, at least at the higher RPMs. It was new turbo tech, so it was laggy. But people didn't care. They loved it. But the engine's factory internals didn't necessarily love the turbo. In fact, the crankshaft had to be changed significantly to handle the extra abuse, as did the clutch. The normal Corvair was fed by two single-barrel Rochester carbs, but the turbo cars actually only used one, albeit larger, single-barrel Carter carburetor. The Carter was a side-draft carburetor which helped to get more air in over a shorter distance. Now the turbo Corvairs were a huge hit, even with the lag. They didn't do much in first year, but beyond that, they were a big help. A 1963 naturally aspirated Corvair Monza did 0 to 60 in about 15 seconds. The Turbo Spider did it in under 11 seconds. And the Spiders also took advantage of a positive traction limited slip rear diff for better handling in the corners and better ability to put down the power. A 4-second 0 to 60 change was a huge improvement for the turbo cars, and it was absolutely undeniable how much the turbo impacted performance. The Corvair was no longer just an economy car, it was a sports car. But as any sports car with the engine fitted towards the back, one of the problems with the Corvair and its suspension setup was that it had a tendency to cause oversteer, and its swing-arm rear suspension didn't help. The car would often lose grip on uneven surfaces due to what's called jacking, which is when a sudden camber change on one side makes the other side bounce, leading to sharply reduced road contact and a sudden loss of traction. And when the back end comes around when all the weight is back there, it makes it difficult to control the vehicle and even right the slide. Chevrolet tried to counter these problems by recommending Corvair owners leave their front tires practically flat compared to their rear ones. They actually suggested cold air pressures of 15 psi in the front and 26 to 28 psi in the back. Now, of course, plenty of people had no idea about this recommendation, so the average Joe would fill the tires up evenly because that's what you did. In 1964, Chevrolet made some changes to the suspension of all the Corvairs to further reduce these problems. These improvements included an anti-roll bar and straps that would limit the motion of the rear swing axle, as well as stiffer shocks and springs. In 1964, the displacement of the Corvair engine was increased from 145 cubic inches to 164, thanks to a longer stroke. This led to more power in the naturally aspirated models, now making about 110 horsepower, but the displacement increase did not result in any increased power for the Turbo Spiders, which continued to be advertised at 150 horsepower in Chevrolet's period literature. You might imagine that those 1964 changes would hold Chevrolet over for a couple more years with the Corvair, but you'd be wrong. In 1965, the whole Corvair line moved on to a second generation. The Spider trim class was replaced with the Corsa trim, which continued to offer a turbo option for 2 more years, 65 and 66. The body redesign headed by Ron Hill for the second-gen cars was an immediate hit. That distinctive no-front grille and the unusual rear-mounted engine continued to pull in potential buyers for just how different it was compared to other American cars. And the new Corsa Turbo Corvair produced 180 horsepower, which was up from the 150 the year before. Peak power was at 4,000 RPM and it made 232 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 RPM. Chevy was able to nudge the compression upward to 8.25 to 1 as part of the upgrades on the motor, and the top speed was now 114 miles per hour versus the 103 mile per hour top speed of the older turbo cars. The turbo was still pretty laggy, leading to the same 0 to 60 time, but once it got going, the new second-gen turbo cars were able to build speed considerably faster than the first-gen ones. The suspension also underwent another complete redesign for the 65 model year. They moved to an independent 3-link rear suspension based on that of the 63 Corvette, and its handling improved even more, to the point that even notoriously skeptical British auto reviewers were impressed with what the new Corvair had to offer. Unfortunately, several factors both inside and outside of Chevrolet were setting up to lead the Corvair, and especially the Turbo Corvair, to an untimely end. First, Chevy was getting ready to release the Camaro, which would end up competing for speed junkies and secretaries alike, and fit their economies of scale better, sort of removing the need in the market for the Corvair. And the Mustang, which just released in 1964, was gaining steam and starting to eat into Chevrolet's market share, especially with the Corvair. And finally, you may remember that I said the Corvair was infamous among the uninformed earlier. This is where Ralph Nader comes in. The first chapter of his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, was published in The Nation, and that chapter called out the Corvair by name for its unsafe handling characteristics. What most people didn't realize, though, is that all the problems that Nader had detailed had been rapidly fixed within the first few years of production, and by the time the second-gen cars rolled around, they were pretty much irrelevant. In any case, though, the pop culture hit piece had enough impact to negatively hurt the public perception of the Corvair. Sales continued to drop for the next few years, and the Turbo Corvair was killed off at the end of '66, marking the end of the poor man's Porsche. But it was such a niche model that had a really strong fan base around it that today there are examples in good condition that are fairly easy to find. With about 50,000 turbocharged Corvairs sold in the US between '62 and '66, prices for a good one in solid condition are generally around 10 to 25 grand, which for such a unique piece of American automotive history, I don't think that's a bad price. But let me know in the comments down below what you think. But that concludes the short history of the turbocharged Corvair. Thank you all for watching another Rare Cars video. I release a new short-form documentary every single week, and I focus on these weird cars that you might not have heard of or want to learn more about.